I'm Ed Amoroso from Tag Cyber, and I'm here with two of my friends, Brian Vecci and David Gibson, who both work for a company called Varonis. And I want to welcome you guys to the studio. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
Nice
Thanks.
to see you.
It's funny, I usually welcome people to New York City, but you're both here all the time, right? You guys are headquartered here.
We're headquartered here. I live here, yeah.
That's great, that's great. So, David, let me start. Tell me a little bit about Varonis, kind of what you guys do with Level Set, and then I want to hear more about you guys and the technology. What's the company do?
Sure. Well, it's interesting. You know, we started operations in 2005 or so, and our founder was at NetApp, storage expert. And I think the interesting thing is what gave him the idea was really he was on site as a consultant at an oil and gas company in Angola, and they would take pictures of the ocean floor with sophisticated equipment, underwater divers, submarines, things like that, for drilling rights.
Wow.
And one day, millions of dollars of these images went missing. And he happened to be on site. It was a coincidence that he was on site. He didn't do it, but they called him in because they knew he was an expert, and they said, "Can you tell us who deleted these images?" And he said, "I'm sorry, you're not tracking that kind of information. You know, I couldn't tell you who was deleting them or opening them or creating them for that matter." And they said, "Well, that's startling. It's an expensive, valuable asset, and we're not watching how it's being used. Could you at least tell us who could have deleted them?" And he said, "Yeah, I can get to work on that." And it actually took him most of the night to go through, because it was a large multinational and they had administrators from all over the world. And he came back the next day with this enormous spreadsheet of all the people that could have deleted these images if they'd wanted to. And the executive said, you know, none of these people have any business reason to even see this data, much less delete it. Can you go through all of our file shares, find the important data, and lock it down so only the right people have access? And at that point, he'd been working the problem for a while, and he saw how big it was, and he said, you know, I don't think I could really do that with 30 consultants in a year. And this is really what sets the stage. You know, in 2000, this was in 2003. In 2003, it was a very different world. There was no cloud, really. We still had floppy disks. I had an AOL account. It was very different, right? And I think he saw that if data was going to be this important and grow this quickly and be this out of control, there was going to be a lot of consequences. And I think that's really what we've seen play out over the last 10, 15 years or so. But that's really the problem set that gave the idea for Varonis. And we've come a long way since. We have 6,700 customers, and we do a lot more than those core use cases, but that's really where it started. Who can touch data, who does touch data, where is it exposed, and how do you lock it down more quickly?
Wow, that's super fascinating. Is that what attracted you to the company? You head up marketing for the company, correct?
Yeah.
How did you come to the company?
I started out in 2006 with Varonis as a sales engineer. And prior to that, I had been at another security company as a sales engineer, and prior to that, I'd done security technology deployments for a consultant. And so when I saw the demo of our solution, and I saw the information that it had, particularly knowing who was actually accessing all these files, and I knew from my previous experience that was just unavailable and really important. And then also who could access data. And one of the questions that people have a hard time accessing is, you know, you pick a random user from the company, what can they touch? And that was just one double click in our interface, and that answer was right there. It really is a kind of our Jerry Maguire, you had me at hello moment when we show people to that.
Now you do the field CTO role.
That's right.
What attracted you to that, and what brought you to the company?
That's not what my role was when I brought to the company. David brought me to the company. I was an IT guy, and I'd been an IT guy at a law firm, I'd been an IT guy at a software company, I'd been an IT guy at a lot of different places, and I was at a bank. And then one day I got an email from an old boss of mine saying,
Are you one of those mean IT guys who makes fun of people like me?
Absolutely, constantly. Yeah, but no, I was a developer. I did all kinds of technology stuff. I was basically a propeller head. And I get an email from an old boss of mine and says, you know what, there's somebody who I want to introduce you to. He's a friend of a friend, and he works for a little company, and they do something with data. I don't know what it was. And so I met David, and he took me through what Varonis did. And what was really funny is I remember that night I went back and I emailed a buddy of mine who was also in IT. And I said, yeah, there's this company, and they can figure out who's got access to what data, they monitor how it's used, and they can figure out who it belongs to. And the guy says, yeah, good luck with that. We've been trying to solve that problem for the last 20 years. Like he called it an intractable problem. But David's pretty convincing. And so he hired me to do a lot of different things, to wear a lot of different hats. And that was in 2010. And so 9 years later, I'm the field CTO. My job is to know a lot about what we do, about how our customers use our technology, about how the problems that we solve, how we solve them, how it works. And I kind of think of myself as the connective tissue between our customers, our partners, our technologists, and our marketing department.
David, your customers are enterprise customers. They're worried about protecting their data. Give me some feel for maybe who comes to you guys with, with a need for the platform, and what are they interested? Is it a pure security play? Is it privacy play? What is it that they're interested in trying to do? And I know you and I debated at times kind of the difference between security and privacy in the context of Varonis.
Sure.
Expand on that a little bit.
So it really is interesting. If you have more than 20 employees and you use files and emails, you're relevant.
Yeah.
Traditionally, we started out talking to a lot of infrastructure folks because they were the ones that were dealing with a lot of these problems, trying to manage access to data. People would call up and say, I need access to this. We need to do a data migration cleanly.
We're going to clean up the stuff that's not being used. We've got to figure out where there's sensitive stuff.
Bigger companies in the beginning.
Well, we'd actually started out, in the beginning you're a startup. You're really going to whoever is going to take a meeting with you.
Fair point.
These days we are more focused on some of the mid-tier to larger enterprises as well. But the way we sell is we say, listen, let us do a free install and look at your data. And that's when the real interesting stuff begins. It's interesting, we can talk about a lot of statistics, like 1 out of every 5 folders is accessible to every employee and things like that.
You guys measured that recently, right?
Yes.
Say that again, 1 out of 5?
1 out of 5 folders on average is accessible to every single employee. And these are through things called global access groups. So they're groups in Windows or in Active Directory that have names, everyone, all authenticated users, domain users, and they do just what they sound like they do. When you apply them to a folder, everybody gets access. All authenticated users get access. And about 1 in 5 of these folders is open to these groups.
There's a story I heard. One of our teams went in and did a risk assessment for a pretty big company. And on the way in, our representative talked to the CISO on the way in right before the meeting. He said, did you know that the receptionist that just let me into the building has access to your salary and the salary of everybody in your executive team and the compensation for everybody at the company? And the CISO looked him in the eye and said, okay, I get that you're here to, some shock and awe, to tell me a fun story, but that there's no way that that's possible. He said, I'll bet you dinner. So they walked back into the receptionist area, had her stand up. Our rep sat down because he knew exactly where this file was because we'd done a risk assessment. We know everything about their data. We know where their sensitive data is. We know where it's exposed. We even know how it's being used. Had her stand up, sat down to the keyboard, brought up a spreadsheet. Here's your salary. Here's the salary of the CEO, salary of everybody else at the company. And we got the deal a little bit later. That happens all the time. One of the reasons that we do a risk assessment and we go in and we show people exactly what we're talking about. It's easy for me to say to you, you know what, 20% of your data is probably open to everybody in the company. And what does that mean to you? Till I sit down and it's your W-2 that's open to everybody.
What's the root cause for this? Is it just complexity that has exploded?
I don't think anybody's sitting around and saying, you know what, this is the way I wish it was going to be. But we live in a really complex world. There's more data than there's ever been. Think about the amount of data that you use on a daily basis. I was sitting in a meeting today and I had my phone next to me, an iPad over here, a laptop over here, and it was true of everybody else in the room. There's more data, there's more ways to access it, more ways to use it, more of it is valuable. Yeah. The things that we store on file shares, people used to think it was just, vacation photos and stuff that didn't really matter, or really important stuff. It's in databases and applications, but that's not true anymore. Look at the story of every single data breach over the last 10 years. It all involves files and emails. So the most valuable data that we have is often the data that we know the least about, and that's what we see over and over and over again.
How do people get through compliance assessments? Like, how do you meet a set of framework objectives if you're not protected? Maybe I'm answering, why you guys exist, but it just strikes me that if you had that situation, I can think of 1,000 NIST controls that are broken, with that scenario.
Compliance is a big driver, especially these days. In 2009, we started looking inside the contents of files to find things that were subject to regulation, like credit card information subject to PCI, health records that are subject to HIPAA, and lots of other, high tech, lots of other regulations. More recently, GDPR. We've started looking for data that falls under that, as well as CCPA. I think that now that there are more data-centric regulations, this has become a much more urgent problem, and there's more of a focus. A few years ago, we might walk into an organization, they say, yeah, we don't have any of that kind of information anywhere on our file shares, and we just keep it here, or that's not in scope. But today, especially after all the different breaches, people are a little bit more aware of the problem, and that they can't just exclude their largest data sets from the compliance exercise.
I think one way to think about it is people are starting to think of data less like something that belongs to the IT guy. When I worked in IT, data was thought, it was a lot like the laptop or the server or the network. If something breaks, it's the IT department's fault, right? Something gets deleted, it's the IT department's fault. But nobody breaks into a bank to steal the pens.
Like
right?
a customer database or marketing information.
This belongs to IT.
To
the IT guys, it's their responsibility to make sure that the right people have access to it and it's properly secured. But that's not the case anymore, right? Data is it's much more like money in a bank account, right? It has value to an organization, it has value to the business, and it needs to have the kinds of controls that, and when I say controls, it needs to have the same kinds of restrictions that other really valuable things have. 1 out of every 5 folders is open to everybody. It's like 1 out of every 5 doors in a building is just open to anybody who wants to go in. And a lot of those doors lead to really, really sensitive places. Companies are starting to change the way they think about their information. Data has real value. If it didn't, get rid of it, but you can't, right? So you need to have a new way of thinking, and really you need new technology to manage access to it.
Has public cloud made things better, worse, same? What's been your observation as people have pushed more workloads out virtually?
The crazy thing about the cloud is it gives us a lot more functionality. It gives us a lot more ability to collaborate. It gives us a lot more.
It saves money.
It saves money, but suddenly you've got no fence around it. There's no perimeter in the cloud, to use a technical term. There's no way to, something that's open to everybody, if it's inside the network, is open to anybody that plugs in your Wi-Fi network.
Same old.
Yeah,
different architecture, but
if it's in the cloud, it could be open to everybody in the world, right?
Okay.
The risk associated with it is much higher than it's ever been. To exfiltrate data inside a data center, you might have to get access to a machine and plug in a USB stick or email it to somebody. To exfiltrate data in the cloud, I can right-click on it and create a link, and you're done.
Yeah, I'm going to guess though, back in the early 2000s when you guys started, probably no cloud. Now I bet every single customer has a bunch of clouds tangled into some hybrid architecture.
Yeah, you're not wrong.
Does the platform kind of account for that? I imagine it must. Right?
Yes, we've followed the data. So in the beginning, it was Windows and the Windows side of NAS
Inside
or
a
CIFS.
firewall.
Yep.
Yeah.
We added Unix and NFS on NAS. We added SharePoint on-prem. We added Exchange.
Yeah.
We've more recently added Office 365 and Box. And our strategy is to follow the data. With 6,700 customers, we get to hear where they're storing data and where they're planning to store data and where they have the biggest challenges. And so we've been able to add, with a single platform, support for all these data stores. And that's really where I think it gets interesting is, that original question, pick a random user, what do they have access to, what did they take? To be able to see over all your data stores the answers to those questions is really something that makes us special.
From a security standpoint, though, the interesting thing about the cloud is, another way to think about the cloud is just, it's somebody else's computer, right? Just like if you're storing something in the cloud, you're storing it on somebody else's computer and everybody can get to it. That's what makes the cloud really useful, and also it makes the cloud really dangerous.
I want to ask you guys a couple of sort of industry marketing things. Now, first off, let me preface, I've been to some of your events. You guys have wildly enthusiastic customers. It seems like you guys have hit on something. These almost 7,000 customers really enjoying what you do. But we were chatting earlier, you're addressing a pretty obvious problem, and yet if I tried to find a few obvious competitors, they kind of don't pop up. Like, you guys kind of cover a lot of ground. How did that happen? Like, it seems like you guys are one of the bigger, more influential, more consequential companies that a lot of people probably watching this video may not be familiar. What's the What's the secret sauce to that?
I think a lot of it was luck and timing.
Yeah.
In 2005 when we started, talked about how the world was different. A company that had 10 terabytes then, there weren't that many. But now they've got hundreds of terabytes or petabytes of data. There was no cloud then. There were fewer versions of SharePoint. In fact, people weren't necessarily even using it like they were
less
today.
Data.
Far less data in far fewer data stores, and with fewer versions of those data stores to support. And so, when we started, we had a very different world. The conditions were right? If the analogy is learning how to swim, right, the conditions were right. It wasn't a bathtub, there was enough to get started, and it wasn't a hurricane. Today, it's more like a hurricane. And so I think when people would have started, you'd have to get in early, maybe around 2007, 2008, but of course 2008 happened, and a lot of companies were not starting up in those days, but that really hardened our organization. We said we're going to innovate, we're going to keep doing our discipline of these risk assessments, and the people that started to try to come into the market later gave up. And we have to ask ourselves, if we had to start today, would we really be able to do that? And it's very difficult with all the data stores and all the complexity, and you think about it, we do all these risk assessments on production data. All of that mileage has really hardened the code. It's really made our software battle tested. We've seen so many wacky configurations out there. They make your head spin. Why would anybody configure something this way? Yeah. But yet we've seen it, and we've learned how to cope with that.
Not just technically, by the way. So our technology has evolved to a point that we've got a 10-year head start on anybody else. The other thing is we've got more than 7,000 or almost 7,000 customers that are actually using it, and there's a methodology. There's a set of steps that you go through to solve these problems, right? You can certainly push a button to solve problem A, but how do you get from A to Z? And so one of the big benefits that we have doing this for as long as we have is we know how to get our customers from A to Z. We know what to do first, second, and third. We know that the first thing you got to do is just put detective controls in place and answer all the known unknowns and unknown unknowns, right? Then you can start fixing problems, and then you can put automation in place to make sure that they stay fixed. Anybody who wants to try to solve those problems not only has to build the tech to do it, and good luck, we got a 10-year head start on you, you also have to have the customer base that teaches you how to do it. And we got that too.
That's good. Did you say known, unknown, unknowns?
No, none.
That kicks ass. I love that. I'm going to steal that from you. That makes sense. Quick question. Architecturally, you guys don't sit lightly atop stuff, man. You climb right into the infrastructure, right?
That's critical.
Is that part of the idea here?
It has to be. You can't solve this problem at a surface level. You need to get down deep. You need to look at every single folder and every single file. You can't figure out who should have access to something unless you monitor every time someone touches any file, sends any email. We're the only ones that do that. So we're the only ones that can really solve this problem because we are so down deep in the data, in the users. We know more about data, users, devices, and how they access data than any other technology, and that means we can solve the problems and keep them solved.
I remember, David, you were explaining this to me last year or something. Now, I didn't know much about the architecture, and I was asking you on the phone, and you were saying we do this, 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 and I'm thinking, how do you do that? And then you said, no, you don't get it. We live in kernel. We're doing that. And I remember I was mid-sip of my coffee, and I went, oh, I see.
That was actually...
That was a moment for me. I remember that.
It was a moment for me, too.
Yeah.
When I saw the initial demo, and Jim O'Boyle, who's our SVP of sales, was doing the demo for me in a bar around Penn Station.
We take a lot of meetings at bars.
No, that's why.
You start seeing the problems that we solve, you need to drink too.
You drink, you do computing, you're set. That's the way you do it.
So he bought me a Guinness, right, and he showed me the demo. And when he got to the audit trail, and I see all the opens, creates, deletes, renames of files.
These are operating systems.
I said, okay, wait a minute, how do you get that information? And I expected him to say, oh, you have to enable the native operating system auditing, and then we collect that.
You collect it through an interface. But you sit below that.
Which I knew that didn't work, actually, from my previous experience. So it's exactly, we wrote a filter, and this was in 2006. It was really the first filter I'd seen that worked. and that people were not afraid to deploy. Well, they were until they tried it. But really, the filter is so well done, and we've written filters for AIX, for Linux, for Solaris, the different versions of on-prem Exchange, the different versions of SharePoint. We always love to have an API to get the information we need, and it's not just the auditing, right? We also collect the permissions information, we also classify the data, and now we collect a lot from AD and from the perimeter. But the insistence on getting the right metadata, the right access activity, has led us to where we wanted to go. And we didn't let it stop us that, for example, SharePoint's native auditing wrote to SharePoint and actually impaired the server, right? The Windows native auditing wasn't granular enough, and it impaired the server.
Microsoft says don't turn it on because it's going to break the box.
At the time, Linux, before 2.6, didn't have any native auditing subsystem, and I had known from Solaris, BSM nobody wanted it on. It took down a whole bunch of Solaris boxes. AIX, the auditing, nobody wanted it on, and so being able to go down to that level to just collect that information was, I think it still is very special, especially on Exchange, to get that information, because the native journaling and diagnostics is not granular enough, and it's distributed, right? You have to go out and collect it, and then you have to pull logs and store those logs on each individual server. So being able to do that in a more intelligent way is really, I think, the tickets to the game, because once you get that information, then boy, are you in for a surprise. Cool. It's not uncommon.
Well, I was going to say, think about what happens when you don't have that information. It's like trying to manage a bank account without ever getting a bank statement, right? So if a company or an organization says, my data is really valuable, why aren't you watching how it's used? Yeah. And as David just said, there is no way, natively, unless you've got Varonis there, to watch how this stuff is being used. So you'll never know. You ever get a notification? I got one the other day. I got a notification that my credit card had been cloned. Somebody was using it to buy gas in Montreal. Company knew instantly that was happening because they know a lot about me. They know who I am. They know where I live. They know what I buy. I travel a lot, but they knew this wasn't me. They knew that I was in New York and that I was not buying gas in Montreal. Well, part of it is because they know a lot about me, but they watch every single penny that goes in and out of that account because that's their business. Yeah. These days, a company's data is their business, and they need to be able to watch every single time someone opens a file or moves it or creates it or deletes it, sends an email, opens something sensitive, put something sensitive where it's not supposed to be. If you can't answer those questions, how do you manage data?
What do you think in the next few years? We'll start with you, David. What is, you guys probably get in a room and start planning out what you need to deal with and what you need to build. What are some themes that pop up in those discussions?
Well, I think we've seen, that each use case that we deliver or help with leads to more use cases. Yeah. One of the ones that I think we need to talk about is the ability to alert, kind of like what you're talking about with the credit card fraud. Yeah. Think about how many times people access files a day. Think about how many DNS queries people make. Think about how many web connections people make. When I say it's tickets to the game with the auditing, hundreds of millions of events a day. How do you hear the music through the noise? How do you really understand when there's something that you need to pay attention to? And the things that we're seeing now is the attackers, both insiders and outside attackers, are getting much more sophisticated. And spotting attacks from both internal and external threats is becoming a very big issue for a lot of organizations. And we've seen from really the earliest days of ransomware how quickly threats can bypass the perimeter, bypass endpoint protection, and then access all these files. Right. And so I think really if I was going to put my crystal ball on, it's almost here. The importance of good detective controls and adequate logging that you can analyze is really important to accelerate the time to detect threats and really help respond to them more quickly as well.
I think that makes sense. What do you think?
Automation. I mean, even the amount of data that we look at in a given organization, you need machine learning and AI, just as David said, separate the music from the noise. You need automation to detect threats. You need automation to get you to a conclusion. Is your data safe? You also need automation to fix things. The problem is too big. I was in a meeting with a customer, and they were a recent customer, And I'm sitting there with the chief legal counsel, and she looks up at the screen. We were showing the results of the risk assessments that we had done. We had scanned they were really concerned about GDPR. GDPR says you need to know where you have personal data, but you also need to make sure that the right people have access to it and that you're monitoring it and you alert when something goes wrong and you let authorities know and that you can find somebody's data if they ask you to. So she was worried about all these controls, and she's not a technologist. She's not an IT person. She didn't really understand the scale of the problem. She had the IT people in the room. And she said, what do you mean? This doesn't make any sense to me. What do you mean we have 335,000 folders that have UK VAT numbers that are open to everybody in the company? That's completely impossible. And down the line, everybody says, yeah, that's what happens. That's the situation that we're in. And I had to say, slow down. I know you're scared. It's an emotional thing. It's like getting punched in the gut. What do you mean all of our data is open to anybody who joins the Wi-Fi network? I said, well, you have two really big benefits. One, you're a Varonis customer, which means you've been watching anytime someone touches any of this data, and you would have known if something went wrong.
Yeah,
so rest a little bit easy, right? Two, you can automatically clean all this stuff up. I can push a button and everything's going to get cleaned up, and I can guarantee that only the right people have access to it. Automation is absolutely critical. You ask about what the next 5 years is, it's going to be making sense of all of this information in ways that it is impossible to send a human being to go make decisions about it.
Automated offense against automated defense. Right?
That's right.
We joke that it'll be like a humidifier and a dehumidifier fighting it out in the room. that's cybersecurity will devolve to. I hope not. Hey, is Varonis a fun place to work? Seems like it seems like it is. Very high energy CEO and company. It seems like you guys are rocking it. It looks like a fun place. So.
Yeah, we've been here for a long time, and I think that's one of the big benefits. The technology is really cool. The people we get to work with are really great, and we're in an exciting space.
You guys come back and visit us when you're 5,000 people or something?
Absolutely.
You have to come back. You can't say, we don't talk to little Ed anymore. We're big now. You come back. Thank you for coming to visit. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having
working
us.
with you guys. Thanks for coming. And we will see you next time.